Hello guys. So today I'm going to be covering creating a basic view rendering. I'm going to show kind of some of the view renderings that we typically create in this demo. So, who am I? My name is Dylan Young. I'm a manager of platforms at Aero Digital. I currently live in Palm Beach, Florida, and I've been working with Sitecore since 7.2. If you would like to reach out to me, you can do so through my blog, LinkedIn, or Twitter, as well as you can reach me on Slack or Stack Exchange as well. All right, so there's two different kind of approaches that we can take when creating a view rendering. Well, technically, a view rendering is just a rendering, not a sub-layout. But if you're working with MVC, typically you'd be creating a rendering or renderings concept, whereas in web forms you'd be creating something called sublayouts. There's really not a huge difference between the two, rendering or sublayout. Just one works with web forms and the other one works with MVC. Also, renderings has a few different fields versus a sublayout. Also, by doing a rendering, you can have insert options versus a sublayout where you'd have different insert options, if that makes any sense. Strategies, things to keep in mind when working with a view rendering are placeholders. So you could create a rendering that is page specific. You could create a home page rendering. Something I typically like to do is go more granular, with this. So I would create maybe grids as a rendering, such as a 6x6 if you're working with Bootstrap, and then placing controls inside of that. So if your home page had a 6x6 grid, and then on the left it contained some sort of form, and then on the right it contained some sort of HTML block. Instead of creating one giant rendering for displaying all of that, I'd rather have a 6x6 and then placeholders for a 6x6 left and a 6x6 right, and then you can insert renderings inside of this rendering using the placeholder to add a form to the left, which would be a separate component or a separate rendering, and then a HTML block or whatever it may be on the right, which would also be a separate rendering. So hopefully that makes sense. So next up, I'm going to show a very simple demo of the best practice, which is creating a simple view rendering with MVC. This is not a Helix approach. If you've seen my other videos, I am using an example project, which I've now set up to include a view. So let's get going with that. All right, on to the demo portion of this training video. Previously we set up a basic layout. This basic layout contains a placeholder for page.grid. So now I can start inserting renderings into this page.grid. For this tutorial, I'll be doing a view rendering for this. So like I just mentioned, typically I would create like a 6x6 grid or something that represents Bootstrap. It depends on what front-end framework that you're using. So for this, I'm just going to go ahead and create a 6x6. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to call this grids. I typically place this in the shared area of the views. And now I can create a simple view rendering by going and creating a MVC partial page. I'll call this 6x6.cshtml. Typically, the model is going to be rendering model, which is the default model that all views will have from Sitecore. And then inside this, I can create a div class container, div class row, and then a div class col mid 6. I don't think I necessarily have Bootstrap installed currently, so I don't know if this will visually appear on the front end. We'll see. And then the div class col that's that. And then inside this, I would typically use a, I believe it's HTML Sitecore placeholder. So to kind of match the naming convention I've been using, and you will come up with your own naming conventions for how you name the placeholders. Just be consistent about it. Is I will call it grid.6x6.left, and then this one will be HTML Sitecore placeholder grid 6x6 right. Now, one tricky problem that you might face is if you have a grid that's 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 for the entire 12 grid. What would you call these? You could probably just call them the name of the current grid number. So if you're grid 1, you'd just call it grid. I don't know what that would be, 12 by 12, or 1 by, I don't know, and then just 1. Or you could give it some different names. I don't know. All is possible. Whatever you decide. It's pretty open. I've never created a grid like that before, but an example would be a 4 by 4 by, or wait, no, 3 by 3 by 3 by 3. So I would typically call actually the 3 on the left side, I'd call that far left, then I'd have left, right, and then far right. So just an idea. So now that I've created that, I'm also going to go ahead and create a very basic HTML block component. I don't think I have the structure in place to set this all up, but I'll go ahead and call this blocks, and I will call this an HTML block. And this block will basically pull this will just pull a field from Sitecore. So if you added this to the page, you could set a data source for this rendering, or you could have it pull from the current context, which would be the item itself. So if the home page item had a HTML field on it, it would pull that data into this block. Ideally, with HTML blocks, you'd want it to pull from a data source instead. So that way you could define different blocks on the page. You could have a title, an intro, some sort of header, and these would all pull from different blocks somewhere else in the content tree. Typically, I'm not a big fan of having too many HTML blocks on a proper Sitecore installation, but for demo's sake, I'm just going to go with an HTML block. So that is that. So, all right, I've defined these inside my Visual Studio project. I'm going to go ahead and publish this. And then I am going to go over back to Sitecore, or to the website, example 82, Sitecore. Probably should refresh. All right, so it's refreshed, and then what I'll do is now I'll start defining the layouts, the renderings that I've created. So inside the layout folder, you'll see that there's a renderings and there's also a sublayouts. So if you were defining web forms, you would actually go into sublayouts and start defining your controls that you're creating. Whereas because we're working with MVC, we're going to actually work in renderings. And something I mentioned earlier is sublayouts. When you insert, it actually will show you can insert sublayout. I think that's the main reason they differentiate between rendering and sublayouts for MVC and other web forms, is just so that the insert options are there for you to insert things. So that's a common question: why is there sublayouts versus renderings for two different techniques? Also, renderings, as you saw, there's a lot more different types of renderings you have, but typically we're going to be showing view rendering, controller rendering in this in my next demo. I might cover some of these other types of renderings later on. So typically inside the renderings folder, I like to create a rendering folder, This rendering folder will have the name of example to match our solution. Inside example, I will define for now, I'm just going to define a more generic name for, I guess grids is what I'll do. So grids will contain all the 6x6s and the 3x3x3x3s and the 4x4x4s and the 12x1s and whatever other various scenarios of grids that you might create. So then I will go ahead and also create another rendering folder, and I will call this blocks. And inside this, I will start actually defining my view rendering. So I'll click Insert, View Rendering when I have blocks selected. And now I'll give this a name. So I'll call this HTML block. And now that's created. So now I need to define the path. This is pretty simple and straightforward. If you go back to Visual Studio, you'll see that it's in views underneath the root of example web. But once this publishes out, it will go inside Sitecore/website/views using the same structure as this. So that's pretty much what it's pulling from. So views, shared, blocks, HTML block. So views, shared, blocks, HTML block. That's CSHTML. That's it. Now you have a view rendering defined. There's some other settings here. Some to note for other scenarios. Parameter templates. If you were to define, for example, some sort of CSS class that a user, if they place an HTML block on a page, if they want to add a CSS class to it, they could define an HTML or a template that defines the parameters that they can define on this rendering. You'll define these down in the templates area, which I'll probably cover in a later session on how to create rendering parameters. There's two kind of styles. Some other things to note is data source location and data source template. So this is what I was mentioning about data sources. So if we had previously defined a template for HTML block, we could now say, okay, when you go to insert a data source for this block, when you place it on the page, you could say pull from this data source location, which could be somewhere up in maybe your global area of your content tree, or maybe even page specific HTML blocks, etc. And then data source template kind of helps you limit what types of templates you can select for an HTML block. So you might have a search control and you don't want to accidentally select an HTML block to be the data source for your search result component, because it'll probably end up breaking the rendering. So this allows you to set, hey, this rendering, the HTML block, will only use this data source, which is a HTML block data source template. Some other things that you could use is compatible renderings. This allows you to, so if you had multiple styles of blocks, like let's say you had a content block, and there you could have a content block with a title and a picture on the left and a picture on the right, or a text on the right, and then you had another compatible rendering, which uses the same structure, everything's the same, but just a different layout to that. You could define these compatible renderings. So when you go to in the Experience Editor and other areas, when you go to change it, it will suggest these options to you as compatible. They basically work the same as the current rendering. So these are similar renderings to your current rendering that you're allowed to change to. And lastly, without going too deeper into anything else, Experience Editor buttons. These are buttons that you can define specifically for when you select a rendering inside the Experience Editor. These buttons would actually show up for your rendering. So you could create some custom. One example in my blog, I mentioned how you can define in the core. You can find a dialog basically that pops up and shows all the fields of that you've specified. And you can say, okay, when you click on this, it will open this dialog that will show these fields and allows you to edit them. This is great when you're working with some sort of multi-list field or something that is a little bit more complex than just a standard title or link field. Also, caching. This is an important area. So it's very important that you set up HTML caching for your components. You can set it up either at a component or rendering level, or even on the inside your templates. You can say this, instead of using these caching settings, you can use these other caching settings. And I have a blog on my blog. There's an article that talks about HTML caching, and I think it might make sense for me to also create a video that talks about this. I think it's vital for developing with Sitecore for efficiency's sake. There's display names, so you can create actually nice names for these blocks instead of the item name. And then really the last one I really want to talk about is this thumbnail. So when you create these renderings, when you're in the experience editor and you go to insert a new rendering, it will show a very unattractive, I think it just shows a square box with a blue like icon in the middle. That's not very helpful. It doesn't tell the content editor or the person working on within the experience editor what you're actually inserting. So you can actually go and have your UX team create icons or thumbnails that represent what these components are. So you typically see this like for the grids that I create. You can actually have it so it kind of shows, like for a 6x6, it could kind of show what a 6x6 would look like. Whereas like a 4-column, it would show 4 kind of rectangles to represent that rendering. So that's pretty much it. There's a bunch of other things in here, but this is really the most important factors of a rendering. So I'll save that item, and now I'll go ahead and just create my 6x6. I won't go too much into detail on this one, but 6x6, I'll call it. I'll scroll back up to the top, and I'll give it a name of views shared grids 6x6. And that is all I need to do. Here's a good example of a compatible rendering. So you could create compatible renderings of all the different grids. So they are pretty much the same type of grid. So when you have a 6x6, you could change it to a 4x8, for example. And it's pretty much the same type of grid. It's got the same settings, got the same everything. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so I've defined that. The next step of working with a view rendering is defining it for your home item or whatever page item that you're wanting to create for, or really wherever you're trying to add these renderings for. Now you could, I'm going to not show the experience editor side of this. I'm going to just show the how to do this within the content editor. But you could set the renderings by going to presentation details and set it just for the home item. But I try to never do this. It does make sense in some situations, like if you know the English example.com, it's going to have a component on the home page that shouldn't necessarily show up in all the other feature sites that you create. Then you would set it in the home item, and you wouldn't necessarily set it in the template itself for the standard values. It's hard to make this judgment call when you're first building your first site. You don't know, you're not even thinking about or know the designs of example microsite.com. So I think it's generally a good practice is to set it on your template standard values for the page that you're working on or component that, or item template that you're working on. So since I'm working on the home, I'll click on standard. I'll go to presentation details, and now I will click edit. Now remember, to set these, you need on the layout, it needs to have already a placeholder defined. I showed this to you earlier on this basic. There's a page.grid. So I'm going to try to add a new view rendering to this page.grid. So I will do an add renderings. And now you'll see that my example, all the ones I defined previously are sitting here. So I'll start out with setting a 6x6. So I will set this to the page.grid, which appears in my layout. I'll say select, and okay, great. Now, as I mentioned previously, I would like to set a HTML block to my 6x6 right or left. You know, I don't have a form, so I'm not going to show that example. But so what I'll do is first let's look at the 6x6 control. Remember, it has a grid 6x6 left and a grid 6x6 right. So now I'm going to say let me add an HTML block to this grid 6x6 right. So if I go back and I do add, and I go and find an HTML block, and I say, okay, I want to add this to the grid 6x6 right. So select. All right, now it's set. Currently, it's not pointing to anything. Actually, let's go ahead and click OK. And for demo purposes, let's go ahead and go into the home item, and I'll create an information section, and I will call this HTML. Remember, when I defined the HTML block, I said pull this field from basically from the current context. It will pull the HTML field. The current context will either be a data source or the current item. So if I go here, HTML, I'll specify it as a rich text area. I'll click save. And now you'll notice it actually creates some additional items underneath here. Typically, you won't necessarily need to work with this. I'll show some demos where I go into deeper detail about these. But if I go back up, and now I click on the home item, you should now see that there is a field here that allows me to actually edit HTML. So I've clicked onto the rich text editor, and now you can actually add. This is a what you see is what you get editor. You can go to the HTML, which is what I'll do, and I'll just add some dummy text here. And that's it. And I'll go ahead and accept that. And now you see that the information is there. I'll click save. And now I will click publish. And I'm just going to go ahead and publish the site just so we make sure we have it all. All right. You see it's created 7 items. It's updated 2 and skipped a bunch of items. So let's go back here and try to refresh. And as you can see, I'm still not sure why that's showing up, but basically what it's done behind the scenes is it's placed this is right here, this structure right here, this is the layout. So inside the layout was that control or that placeholder called page.grid. So inside page.grid, it's inserted the 6x6, which is this right here. And then inside of the grid 6x6 right, I've specified that I'm going to pull an HTML block. That HTML block had a field for HTML, which then pulls from my the current context item, which is the home item, and it pulls its HTML field. And there you go. Simple as that. And that is pretty much the basics to creating view renderings. It's a fairly easy process, and as you build, these sites out, you'll have more and more view renderings. Uh, at some point, you're going to enter into a realm where you want to have more controller renderings. View renderings, I feel, are great for a front end dev to be working with. If you just need to drop something onto a page and you just want to start styling and adding items to the page without actually knowing any backend development, a view rendering is a great place to start. Whereas when you start getting into controller renderings, you're going to start doing more MVC style development, and it's a great place for you to, if you want to do unit testing, etc. You actually will always want to have a controller rendering instead of a view rendering. But if your front end team is integrated into your development cycle and working within Sitecore, I think it's great that they know how to set up a view rendering. But that's my personal opinion. It depends on how you have things set up. So, all right, this concludes this demo. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to comment or reach out to me via those, my Twitter, Slack, Stack Exchange, my email, any way that you wish to seek my assistance. I'm here to help anytime. All right, thank you. Bye bye.